I'm starting out with a lemon to sort of remind all of us and myself of the platitude that we all learn very early in life when things go wrong, and that is when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. Your parents all told you that. And for me, that saying has more to do with the choice. When a plan goes wrong, when you're involved in a project and things start going wrong with that project, you can get involved in being angry, you can let yourself be upset about it, you can give up, or you can, and you can feel resentment. But as a good friend of mine pointed out to me, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other guy to die. And so the real answer is to do something about it. And that's where these two words come in. Gumption is the ability to see that there's a need for something and the temerity to believe that you can actually do something about it, whether or not you have any experience in it, because I believe that you can teach yourself most anything. And the other is tenacity, meaning if things start getting difficult, do not give up. As Winston Churchill said, never, never, never give up. I started out as a climber. I've been climbing about 35 years now. I climb in the Schwangunks, the Gunks, which is about 75 miles north of New York City. And I've been going there for many years and camping out and sleeping in my little camper. That's me in front of my camper there. And for many years, wishing that there was some place there where climbers could put up a tent and be welcome, or get a bunk room, get a cup of coffee in the morning, a shower after climbing all day. And I was thinking that whole time, one of these days, I'm going to get some property up here, and I'm going to build a climber's ranch, and there'll be someplace nice for climbers to hang out. And in the meantime, I was living in New York City, and I had a business. I got into the climbing business, and we did stunt work around the city, off buildings and bridges. I had a portable climbing wall. I used to run around all over the place for events and build climbing gyms, and we did trade shows, all that kind of thing. And the whole time I'm planning, one of these days I'm moving upstate and I'm buying a property. And it just took finding the right place. One day one of my friends took me over to the Tuttletown grist mill, and he said, you can't afford this place, but you got to go see it. It's exactly what you want. And it was. It was climber heaven. There was a 240-year-old still operating water-powered grist mill on the property, making Hasidic, making kosher flour for Passover matzah. And there would be a crew of Hasidic millers that would come up every year and grind for 3 months. It had 3,000 feet of riverfront on this protected river, a lot of open land and woodland, and a real Huck Finn swimming hole. I mean, this place was exactly what I was looking for. So I spent the next year negotiating the deal, negotiating the purchase, and raising money from friends and family, and eventually I bought it. And as soon as I bought it, the neighbors descended. This was my first big lemon. The neighbors came to me and told me they didn't want my raping, pillaging climbers around the neighborhood. They didn't want them crossing the river and robbing their houses at night, and all these things that climbers are known for all over the world. So they came and told me that we're going to stall you until you run out of money and have to sell the place and move away, and that's exactly what they did for the next 3 years. We ran out of money. Eventually, as I said, we did run out of money, and I had to sell off half of the property in order to pay off the lawyers and the engineers and live, pay the mortgage and the taxes and that sort of thing. And I had to come up with another way to make my dream come true, which was to have that place in the country and live near the cliffs that I love climbing on. So I called the local zoning officer, and we started looking at ways to get around this problem and make this thing happen. And he said to me that you're in a farm district. And if you're in a farm district in New York State, you have a right to farm. Because I'd asked him, what can I do that I have a right to do that no one can stop me from doing? Because I was determined to make a living on this property. And he suggested that wineries in New York are considered a farm use, and I should look into a winery. Well, I don't know that much about wine, and the world is awash in wine. When I started looking into it, I appreciated his help, so I did research, and I read the law and to find out what I was up against. And there were 228 other wineries in New York, and New York is in the Northeast, so growing fruit in the Northeast, as you know, is not very easy to do. And I knew it would take years to establish vines and get a product that I could sell. But in the course of looking at that law, I discovered a new distillery license that had just been put into place the year before by New York State. And the thing about the distillery license that was unique was that it lowered the cost of acquiring a distillery permit from $60,000 down to $1,000 for 3 years. And I saw that and I thought, wow, whiskey, I could do that. And I didn't know a thing about making alcohol. I didn't know, I'd never touched a still, I didn't know anything about it, but I thought, I can learn this. So I spent that winter fermenting apple cider in my basement, and then distilling it off on my stove in the kitchen, which of course made the whole house stink, because what I was making was pretty poor quality. You wouldn't want to drink it. But that wasn't the idea. What I wanted to do was figure out what was going on in the still. I had to understand that. So I made a physical model of it. I made a small still out of a tea kettle and some copper tubing that I wound up and plugged into a pot full of water. I got the design off a website called dangerouslabs.com. And it worked. By the end of the winter, I felt like, I know this. I think I can do this. But the problem was I didn't have the technical knowledge. I wasn't a scientist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. But I needed that information eventually. Meet Brian Lee. This is my business partner. He's an electrical engineer, grew up in Minnesota, an Eagle Scout. I met Brian when he was in charge of the build-out of ESPN's high-definition studio in Bristol, Connecticut. He hated it. He wanted to make something. This is a man who builds Windsor-back chairs for a hobby. He built his son a kayak from scratch by hand. And he needed to make something. Plus, he'd also just gone back to the university and gotten his MBA. So he had this degree burning a hole in his pocket. He wanted to start a business. He had volunteered with a group that rebuilt a historic mill in Westchester County. And so he wanted to come and buy my mill from me and make flour, make artisan cornmeal and flour and things like that. And I said, well, okay, spend some time with the miller. The mill was still operating. We were still making flour. The Hasidic crew was there. And George Smith, the old miller, was still there working with them. So he went and spent a couple of days in August with George blowing grain and came back to me later and said, it's not a job change, it's a death sentence. And he was right. You know, we sat down on the rock wall next to the mill, and I said, look, you're making flour here, you're selling it, it's sold in every grocery store in the country for $2.50 for 5 pounds, and you're making it with a 240-year-old wooden water-powered machine that works for 3 months, and then you spend 9 months fixing it, getting it ready for the next time. So he went home and thought about it for about 3 days, and I got an email, 5 words, okay, let's build a distillery. We were mail-order brides. We knew nothing about each other, and neither of us knew a thing about alcohol except how to open a bottle. But we started studying, and we spent the next 2.5 years figuring out how to make alcohol, building out the granaries into the distillery and storage room, and sort of preparing ourselves for what we were coming up against and building out the spaces themselves. And we built our first distilling room, and getting the still from Germany, we installed it in this distilling room. And we had to teach ourselves pretty much everything. We did the electrical work, we did the plumbing. When it came time to hook up the vodka column, I had to learn how to weld stainless. We built our furnaces ourselves and did all the steam fitting ourselves because we couldn't afford to pay anybody else. And eventually we started making spirits. And the first thing we did was a vodka from apples. So we'd go around, I'd take my pickup truck and go down to the local apple processing plant and pick up a whole load of rejects and peels and cores, and we'd bring them back and grind them into cider and then ferment them and distill them off to vodka. And it was a pretty popular vodka. Heart of the Hudson, it was called, and a very tall bottle. It was very pretty. And it did very well up and down the Hudson Valley. I loaded it in the trunk of my car and drove up and down the valley and into Manhattan. And I'd walk in with it, and they'd say, well, the line for the liquor salesman over there. And I'd say, I'm not a liquor salesman. I made this. And that would always get me to the front of the line. So it was doing pretty good, and then we decided to move on to whiskey, which was a real challenge because it involved a whole raft of other jobs you had to do. And we did eventually produce the first bourbon ever made in New York, and it was the first legal whiskey made in New York since Prohibition. And that gave us a real head start. So suddenly we started noticing we were getting an enormous amount of press because we had a first starter advantage. We were the first ones making whiskey in New York since Prohibition. People were paying attention. And we started noticing that the writing was not so much about us. it was starting to be a little broader in scope and was talking about all the other people around the country, the other individual eccentrics who were trying to make whiskey in their basements or in their garages, and also trying to get permits, as we did, to make alcohol on a small scale. At the time, there were only 6 small distilleries in the country. So we joined their core. And what we discovered was that there was a trend that was transforming into a movement. There were people all over the country building small distilleries that we didn't know about until we started going to these little conferences like the American Distilling Institute and meeting them all. And they were all just as crazy as we were. Very few of them knew what they were doing. There's no manual for building a distillery. You have to make it up as you go along. And you run up against a lot of problems. But one of the things about a movement, transforming a trend into a movement, is that that movement has to have some relevance. And for us, where we were in a farm area and in New York State, the relevance we discovered was farming, agriculture. Many small farms were selling out, orchards were selling out to developers with fat checks in their hands. And we wanted to find a way to stop that. And one of the ways we discovered was not to give these farmers money, give them charity. It was to give them a product they could sell that they could really make some money on. And we calculated that if we made their apples, for instance, into vodka or into apple brandy, they'd be worth about 6 times as much as they were if they sold them just out of the orchard. So we started to look at farms, and we started working on the politics of distilling. One of the things that was a problem with the distillery and the distillery license we had was that you couldn't sell goods at the distillery. You've all been to wineries and breweries where you've got a tour and then sampling, and you could buy some of their products right there. Well, you couldn't do that if you had a distillery. So I started lobbying in Albany, and I knew nothing about getting a law passed. I just called up my local legislator and said, "How do I do this?" And they walked me through it, and I spent the next 4 years with 3 governors trying to get the law passed, and eventually, in 2007, the Farm Distillery Act was passed into law, and that allowed us to open up a shop. It also required that we use 70% New York-grown agricultural materials in our products. Since 2007, we opened up our tours, we opened up our little shop, we hired extra people, and since 2007, 30 new farm distilleries have opened in New York, 12 of them in Brooklyn. Farm distilleries in Brooklyn. But it also generates a lot of other things. We made 18 new jobs at our distillery. This is our family now. These people work with us. But that's not unique. All of the distilleries across the country, when we started there were 6, now there are over 400. All of them are hiring people. They're paying sales tax, they're paying excise tax, and they're involved in this movement that's going on across the country. We're thinking, great, we got it made. We are on our own schedule. We can make the goods as we like, and everything's moving along very nicely. But then the reality of big alcohol came knocking on our door. William Grant and Sons, and they make Glenfiddich and the Balvenie and things like that, Hendrick's Gin, and they called us one day and said, "Gee, you guys have been popping up on our radar. We want to come talk to you." The next day, they arrived with the CEO of Grant USA, and we walk them in a suit through the whole primitive distillery we have, and at the end, they invited us down to New York City, and we went down and talked some business with them. They wanted to buy everything. But it's a primitive operation and a new distillery, and we sort of said, you're not going to want to write a check big enough to make us walk away from this thing we've just spent 6 years building, physically building. And they were right. So we were right. So instead, we sold them the Hudson brand of whiskey, and we were sort of on our way. I went out and bought myself a car. And then one night, I was on my way home at about midnight, December 21st, 2010, and I entered this curve about a quarter mile from my house. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up 30 days later in Albany Medical Center in the surgical intensive care unit after I'd already undergone a number of surgeries, and I spent the next 3 months in Albany, laying on my back in the surgical ICU unit, and then a month after that in a hospital in Hawthorne getting rehabilitation. When I woke up, of course, I didn't know what was going on, and my wife and my son explained it to me, and I looked around at the doctors and my family surrounding me, and I realized things were not good. I was in bad shape. But after the 4 months, I managed to get myself home. Took another 2 or 3 months laying on my back there before I got back to my desk. And I was very eager to get back to my desk. When I woke up, I was trying to get the nurses to rearrange my hospital room so that I could get my filing cabinets in. They didn't want to do that. Anyway, after this, I managed to get back with the help of my family and my friends and everything. Yeah, that's the mess that my car was in when they found me. And so we went back to work. And the next thing to do was to come up with a new product, because we realized if we're making whiskey for grants, we can't make whiskey for anybody else, but we didn't want to depend on one client and one product for the future of our distillery. So we started working on a gin. And we went back to our roots and started using apples again. So this gin was 80% wheat and 20% apples. Worked out very well. We got ourselves a distributor right away because we'd done so well with the whiskey. And it started to spread out across the country. And we started to think about what are we going to do next and how are we going to expand to meet this need. And then we had a little accident. In the business, it's called a vapor release. The vapor, one of the fixtures on the still broke. At one point, it was a failed weld, not my weld. And the vapor started shooting out of the top of the still at about 70% alcohol, filling the room, and it eventually hit an ignition source, a light or a fan or something like that, and it went boom. We're standing outside watching these flames pouring out of the roof of our distillery that we just spent all these years building. And I was a wreck until my partner Brian came over to me and said, "We have an insurance policy." And thank God he'd written a check every month. So with the insurance policy, we were able to go back in there. We were able to pull the stills out of the roof of the building, out of that big, large set of flames. In the middle there was a cupola. And most of the vapor had blown out the windows, so it burnt off outside the building. So we had the best of the worst situation. No persons injured, no structural damage, and we had this great insurance policy. So we started rebuilding. And we built a new section on the distillery, ordered new equipment, and we put the whole thing back together again. The engineers at Grants told the CEO that we probably wouldn't be back in operation for a year, considering the damage. And 3 months later, we were back in full production and producing our whiskey, an enormous amount of whiskey for Grants, and also our gin. And then we started looking for another new thing, and we went further back to our roots, and we re-established the vodka brand and renamed it, put in a nice, pretty little new package thing, and now that's our new product that's just been introduced. And we only sell it at the distillery because we're trying to bring people there. So in conclusion, the real message is that if you're going to start out on a new project and it hasn't been done before and you want to get it spreading out, you have to have the gumption, first of all, to believe that you can do it, that it is something that you can do. And you can. It's amazing what you can learn and what you can accomplish with some time and patience and tenacity, because there'll be lemons coming over the transom at you every single day. Something will go wrong. So you can't give up. Never give up. And when you have the next time that lemon comes over and hits you in the head, remember, make the lemonade. Thank you.